Oh, I've been waiting around, hoping things might have changed since our last time around, but now it's getting late. It's always something with ya. You show up late, I miss ya. I'm tired of fighting with ya. I know I gotta go with ya. I'm about to lose my mind. I called 1,000 times. I always wonder why I gotta hurry up and wait for you. Cause it wasn't on home. I'm sitting by the telephone. Come on, honey, let it rain. It's the last time you're gonna hear me sing. I'm about to lose my mind. I called 1,000 times. I always wonder why I gotta hurry up and wait for you. Yeah, I'm about to lose my mind. I called 1,000 times. I always wonder why I gotta hurry up and wait for you. I'm waiting, I'm waiting, I'm waiting. 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 I'm Oh, I've been waiting around, hoping things might change. Since our last time around, but now it's getting late. It's always something with ya. You show up late, I miss ya. I'm tired of fighting with ya. I know I gotta go with ya. I'm about to lose my mind. I called 1,000 times. I always wonder why I gotta hurry up and wait for you. Cause it wasn't no one's home. I'm sitting by the telephone. Come on, honey, let it rain. It's the last time you're gonna hear me sing. I'm about to lose my mind. I called 1,000 times. I always wonder why I gotta hurry up and wait for you. Yeah, I'm about to lose my mind. I called 1,000 times. I always wonder why I gotta hurry up and wait for you.
Like walking into a dream, so unlike what you've seen, so true but it seems, 'cause we've been waiting for you, falling into this place, giving you a small taste of your afterlife, so stay, you'll be back as soon anyway. I see a distant light, my girl, this can't be right. Such a surreal place to see, so wild in this come to be, rock to Wally. And when I think of all the places I just don't belong, I've come to grips with life and realize this is going too far. I don't belong here, we gotta move on here, escape from this afterlife.
Master P. He was a game changer for hip-hop, period.
This man is a reason rappers are able to make millions.
We got a lot of business savvy, and we got rich fast. That was just the power of No Limit and Master P.
It was crazy. Movies, music, No Limit was just taking over.
I told him I wanted $3,500. P gave me a check for $35,000.
Who did that prior to him?
One of the great dynasties in hip hop. That's Master P's legacy.
No Limit Chronicles, Wednesdays, only on BET. You heard me?
speed is what we desire. Lost, hit the wall, watch you crawl. Such a replaceable liar. And I know you hear their voices. And I know they may seem real, but our lives made up of. They took for granted your soul, and it's ours now to steal. As your nightmare comes to life, you should have known the price of evil, and it hurts to know that you belong here. No one to call, everybody to feel. Your tragic fate is looking so clear. It's your fucking nightmare. Before the story begins, is it such a sin for me to take what's mine until the end of time? We were more than friends before the story ends, and I will take what's mine, create what God would never design. Our love had been so strong for far too long. I was weak with fear that something would go wrong before the possibilities came true. I took all possibility from you. I almost laughed myself to tears, conjuring her deepest fears. Must have sound of 50 fucking times. I can't believe it. Ripped her heart out right before her eyes. Eyes over easy. Eat it, eat it, eat it. Wish she was never concealed in bed even when she was sleeping. Now she's just so perfect. I've never been quite so fucking creeping. It goes on and on and on. I can keep you looking young and preserved forever with a fountain spray on your youth whenever. 'Cause I really always knew that my little crime would be cold. That's why I got a heater for your thighs. And I know it's not your time, but bye-bye. And a word to the wise, when the fire dies, you think it's over, but it's just begun. Baby, don't cry. You had my heart, at least for the most part. 'Cause everybody's gotta die sometime. We fell apart. Let's make a new start. 'Cause everybody's gotta die sometime. Yeah, yeah. But baby, don't cry. heater for your thighs. And I know it's not your time, but bye-bye. And a word to the wise, when the fire dies, you think it's over, but it's just begun. But baby, don't cry. You had my heart, at least for the most part. 'Cause everybody's gotta die sometime. We fell apart. Let's make a new start. 'Cause everybody's gotta die sometime. Yeah, yeah. My baby, don't cry. My heart, at least for the most part. 'Cause everybody's gotta die sometime. We fell apart. Let's make a new start. Oh. 'Cause everybody's gotta die sometime. Yeah, yeah. My baby, cry. State line, miles away from those I love, purpose hard to find. While I recall all the words you spoke to me, can't help but wish that I lives are closed. Can't help but think of the times I've had with you. Pictures and some memories will have to help me through. Oh yeah. Dear God, the only thing I ask of you is to hold her when I'm not around, when I'm much too far away. We all need that person who can be true to you. I left her when I found her, and now I wish I'd stay. 'Cause I'm lonely and I'm tired. I'm missing you again. No, no. Once again. Well, some search, never finding a way. Before long, they waste away. I found you. Something told me to stay. I gave in to selfish ways. And how I miss someone to hold when hope begins to fade. A lonely road crossed another cold state line, miles away from those I love, purpose hard to find. Dear God, the only thing I ask of you is to hold her when I'm not around, when I'm much too far away. We all need the person who can be true to you. I left her when I found her, and now I wish I'd stay. 'Cause I'm lonely and I'm tired. I'm missing you again. Oh no. Once again. Yeah,
When you walk into an Amazon fulfillment center, it's like walking into the chocolate factory and you want a golden ticket. All of these are face masks. This looks like a bottle of vodka. When we first got these, we were like, whoa! My 3-year-old, when we get a box delivered, screams, "Mommy's work."
Mommy's work?
With this pandemic, safety is even more important to make sure we go home safe every single day.
Never feared for anything, never shamed but never free. A life that healed the broken heart with all that it could. Lived a life so endlessly, saw beyond what others see. I tried to heal your broken heart with all that I could. Will you stay? Will you stay away forever? How do I live without the ones I love? Time still turns the pages of the book, it's burned. Place and time always on my mind. I have so much to say, but you're so far away. Lands of what our futures hold, foolish lies of growing old. It seems we're so invincible, the truth is so cold. A final song, a last request, a perfect chapter laid to rest. Now and then I try to find a place in my mind where you can stay awake forever. Seize the day, you'll die regretting the time you lost. It's empty and cold without you here. Too many people to wake over. I see my vision burn. I feel my memories fade with time, but I'm too young to worry. The streets we travel on will undergo a sunrise past. I found you here, now please just stay for a while. I can move on with you around. I hand you my mortal life, but will it be forever? I'd do anything for a smile, holding you till our time is done. We both know the day will come, but I don't wanna leave you. I see my vision burn. I feel my memories fade with time, but I'm too young to worry. A melody, a memory, just one picture. Seize the day, you'll die regretting the time you lost. It's empty and gone without you here. Too many people to wake around. Newborn life, replacing all of us, changing this fate for living. No longer needed here, so where do we go? Will you take a journey tonight? Follow me past the losing the fight. I treated you so wrong, now let me make it alright. I'm not insane, I'm not insane. I'm not insane, I'm not insane. Come back to me, it's almost easy. Come back again, it's almost easy. Come back to me, it's almost easy. Come back again, it's almost easy.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Talks at GS. I'm Dan Hibbert, Head of Organizational Design and People Experience in Human Capital Management. I'm honored to be joined today by Professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who is a professor of history, race, and public policy at Harvard Kennedy School, and the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Studies. He is a leading voice on criminal justice and police reform, and the author of a thought-provoking book called The Condemnation of Blackness: Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, which won the 2011 John Hope Franklin Best Book Award in American Studies. Professor Muhammad, thank you so much for joining us today.
Dan, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Professor Muhammad, first I just want to start by asking you as a historian think about the legacy of C.T. Vivian and John Lewis, how do you think about their legacy in the context of some of the conversations that are happening today and their commitment to conversations on race and justice in America?
Well, Dan, how timely a question, given that they both passed last Friday, a real loss to humanity, and more particularly two individuals who made great sacrifices on behalf of the Black community, first and foremost, and on behalf of the nation, secondarily. I think that for me personally, I had the opportunity, I'm very grateful for having interviewed C.T. Vivian while I was director of the Schomburg Center, and the same for John Lewis at the Brooklyn Museum, and having shown him the actual archives of SNCC behind the scenes at the Schomburg Center. So for me personally, the work of these two gentlemen, these giants, in many ways is a model of everything that we know it takes to make real change possible. It is not just personal sacrifice. It's not just strategy and commitment. It's also community work. It is going to the heart of the problem. It is about power. And neither one of them was afraid to literally stare down the force of power that they faced in the case of state troopers, for C.T. Vivian, as well as for John Lewis, and so many other stories that their lives help us to see clearly what is the work ahead of us.
Yeah, they definitely leave some big shoes for us to fill on the leadership side when it comes to the journey of justice. If we pivot to now and we think about the conversations that are happening in the current moment around justice, there's been a series of conversations that were probably ignited or sparked by the tragic death of George Floyd, but the reality is you and I both know that this isn't new. This has happened before in the recent past with Eric Garner or Mike Brown, but then you can go even further back to Emmett Till. So how do you think about the conversation that a lot of people are having? I'm being asked myself, like, will this time be different? And you have a unique vantage point because you have the benefit of being able to look back to look forward. But in your perspective and in your studies, what's different about this time and kind of, is it different?
So, you know, the interesting thing about history is, as Mark Twain famously says, it doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And as someone who is very committed to understanding the past in order to remake the present and the future, history Mark Twain was right, it can't exactly repeat itself, because part of what makes this moment different is that people in the streets and have been in the streets for the past 2 months have learned something from the civil rights movement, are reacting in part to the limitations of what the civil rights movement meant in our political culture beginning in the late 1960s when we shifted from social justice and racial justice to law and order. So there's a lot to be said for the relationship of Black Death, of the killing of Emmett Till by white supremacists in the South, and the understanding by community activists of the killing of unarmed Black people that's been going on for a very long time, but has been captured on cell phone video over the past decade, and the relationships between those two images of young Black men being killed unjustifiably, and in some cases strictly out of racist thought and sentiment. And yet, and still, what makes this moment most particularly different is the scale and scope of white participation in these protests. The civil rights movement was not a mass protest movement by the white community. It was barely a mass protest movement by Black folks in many Southern communities. The best you could say for the mass in the civil rights era was the March on Washington in the summer of 1963. We've never seen this many people for this long in so many different communities that don't even have Black populations, or states for that matter, like Oregon, that have so few African Americans. So we're in uncharted territory with regard to the scale and scope of these Floyd-inspired protests. But America has had a long capacity of embracing reform when it was necessary and then backsliding. So it's not clear to me that looking back on this moment in 25 years from now, will we be able to say, here we go again?
So that kind of leads me to my next question, which is, we've even had Breonna Taylor, right? And that has awakened, it's created a whole lot more emotions around the frustration of, there's been a lot of conversation about reform, but not necessarily any policy that's been implemented. What do you think it's going to take for real reform to happen in the U.S.?
Yeah, so this question is really a corollary of the first, and that is that the longer there is actual pressure put on elected officials and agency heads, particularly in law enforcement, but also with regard to gubernatorial administrations where most of the criminal justice action actually is, the more likely we are to see substantial and sustained reforms. Without challenging power, and in many ways calling for the redistribution of that power from being contained within the police agency and police unions and filtering out back into the community where it belongs. Remember, policing is just an arm of the state. The state gains its power from its citizens. And so when people in these communities that have suffered the longest from bad policing, from racist policing, from systemically violent policing, are calling for more community control over public safety, that is the highest expression of our democratic principles. And so when we see sustained engagement around that before we move behind closed doors where the sausage of legislation gets made, the more likely we are to see some serious change happening.
So on the topic of policing, you, in your book, The Condemnation of Blackness, you talk about the history of racial hierarchies that we're seeing in policing and the fact that the way that modern policing works today can be traced all the way back to slavery. Could you talk to us a little bit about the history of policing and how it leads us to the situation that we're in now?
Yeah, so, it's interesting. As a historian who's written about the history of criminal justice going back to the late 19th century, policing has never been a major subject of historical investigation. I can think of about a dozen books when I was a graduate student that really centered on policing. Most history centered on prisons, and most of the discussion about policing was often at the intersection of European immigrants and the journey that they traveled from being on the short end of a police baton to becoming police chiefs and fire chiefs and using the social mobility of the civil servant sector as a means to the American dream. But what we know about policing is that it's always been about policing the essential workers in American society. There's no golden era of policing where everyone's due process and equal protection was guaranteed to them. We didn't even have such laws on the books, frankly, until the 14th Amendment after slavery. But even by the definition of the Bill of Rights, it was always poor people, low-income people, out groups, and those who were deemed here for labor extraction and purposes rather than to be part of property-owning class and the affluent. And so when we look at the period roughly from the 17th century up through the end of the Civil War, the vast majority of the law enforcement bureaucracy, particularly in relationship to African Americans, was about keeping surveillance on people who were owned, keeping track of runaways, ensuring that African American people or enslaved Africans would not insurrect or rebel or burn down the plantations where they lived. And that was the basic infrastructure of the vast majority of policing in the South, because it was more than any other thing, it was that class of people who were technically chattel or property that kept people up at night. But we can look in other places, particularly where there were fewer African Americans, and see similar concerns and anxieties about Native Americans. We can see similar concerns and anxieties about lower status European immigrant populations as we move into places like Boston by the mid-19th century. So the story of policing is really the story of keeping track of the poor, the marginalized, the racialized, and those who were deemed an inherent threat to American society.
And then with the end of the Civil War came the 13th Amendment. But could you talk to us a little bit about the connection between the 13th Amendment and then the slavery loophole, and how did that lead to further criminalization of Black people in America?
Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward story. And in some ways, it's surprising. Even the sensibilities that we have about a more perfect union, about getting it right, about moving forward, about each being better than the past, it's still incredibly striking that the 13th Amendment essentially says that slavery shall be abolished and indentured servitude except as punishment for a crime. It's still on the books. There's been no amendment to repeal that portion of the 13th Amendment. And so what it made possible was literally within a matter of months after the surrender of the Confederate Army, people who were in charge of the South before federal occupation during the Reconstruction era went back to work and figured out that they could use the law as an instrument of racial control. And that's exactly what they did. They passed a series of black codes across all 11 Confederate states. And those codes essentially mapped out every form of Black freedom that could then be subject to criminalization. And what do I mean by that? Casting a ballot for a Republican. It meant controlling one's own land, controlling the economic output of one's own land, being a parent to one's own child, because enslaved people didn't own, essentially have responsibility for their own children. All of those things were subjected to criminalization, which had what we'd say net widening effect. And the net widening effect essentially meant that there was massive discretion and abuse between plantation owners, landless whites, and a very anemic law enforcement community. The South didn't have a robust law enforcement community that grew over time. But what was the point of all of this? The point of all of these black codes was mass criminalization. The point was to ensure that Black people under the 13th Amendment would not have the basic guarantees of citizenship to conduct their affairs as they chose. They would be coerced back into a subservient economic relationship based on terror and domination back onto plantations. And in fact, when you broke one of these codes, you could be subjected to a sheriff's auction and sold to the highest bidder back to the plantation owner. The 14th Amendment more or less got away with the explicit racism of the Black codes, but the basic infrastructure of the nation continued to exploit the 13th Amendment and to massively criminalize the African American population for the next 150 years.
But then as we got into the 1900s and the mid-1900s, we started to see the police force become more professionalized. And then as they become more professionalized, the data that they were using to measure their progress or their impact started to change. So can you talk to us a little bit about how that also impacts criminalization, and if there needs to be reform in the space of the data that we're using in policing, what that should look like?
Yeah, so data is a really interesting thing. I mean, for any private sector agency, public sector, I mean, there's nowhere you can't go without the call for data as a form of metrics to ensure that performance is being achieved, to make sure that there's accountability and transparency. But one of the fascinating histories of data itself with regard to the criminal justice system is that data is itself an expression of political power. And so let me give a quick example. Some of the first administrative demographic data that was used to essentially argue that African Americans were a particular dangerous class, which could then justify various discriminatory forms of policing, particularly outside of the South, where Northerners tended to believe that they weren't racist, that there wasn't systemic racism, was census data in 1890, which showed an overrepresentation of African Americans. They were 12% of the general population, but nearly a third of those incarcerated. So if you just stop there, the data showed a racial disparity. The racial disparity understood at that time was not a reflection of systemic racism. It was understood and argued and interpreted as evidence of a formerly enslaved population that was uncivilized and unprepared for freedom. And in that way, the data spoke for itself as an objective truth, but underlying the data, of course, was all of this discrimination. Was the surveillance, the targeting, the over-sentencing, the coercive use of the state as a form of ensuring that Black people would have second-class citizenship. Similar things happened for Irish immigrants, Italian Americans, Polish Catholics in northern cities where they made up the vast majority of the low-income community. But here's the kicker. Over time, liberals in the North looked at the data on European immigrant populations and said, this is feeding into racial stigmatization, xenophobia, nativism. Certain conservative reactionary forces are trying to close the borders to these communities, but these are hardworking immigrants. They deserve a shot. What did they do? They stopped keeping track of their crimes. To this day, you can't look up in any police annual report or any uniform crime report and see how many Italian Americans committed a burglary or how many Irish Americans committed armed robbery. It doesn't exist. So data itself, while it may tell us something about what's happening in society, it may count the actual numbers of people arrested in a particular community or the number of people behind bars, but it tells us absolutely nothing about the social and political forces that swirl around the actual lived experiences of those people. Another quick example, the fact that the federal government, until quite recently, didn't even attempt to keep track of a uniform standard of police use of force and killings of people shows you that the power of these local agencies to not report what could be subject to federal scrutiny is a form of not having data, not because people weren't asking the question, but because the power and the politics around the accumulation of data is as important as what we actually have. So today, the question really is not about who's committing crime and how much crime has actually happened. The data innovation that is happening right now is how to do a better job keeping track of police behavior in various communities across America.
If you were to try to unravel the systemic racism that's built into the system, designed into the system, where would you even start?
So here's the thing that, again, might be surprising. It's a little bit counterintuitive. So this is going to be the hardest way to answer this question, to sort of cut to the chase. So the best justification for the kind of policing that's been going on, again, with heavy saturation in quote unquote high crime areas. This is what Darren Wilson, who killed the 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, said of his community. It was a high crime area. So the idea, the governing logic going back to really the late 1960s and 70s is high crime areas deserve more police officers. That's the way to ensure public safety. But it turns out that there is not a single shred of causative evidence that more policing, and of course more prisons, because when you do more policing, more people are arrested and convicted and charged, because 95% plead out, which means whether people are guilty or innocent, they're facing serious time. And so they often, as innocent people, choose to plead to the actual lesser offense. But what this looks like essentially is that you have this gigantic system that is growing in response to harm within a community. But what we know, both in the US and around the globe, is that violence went up in the 1980s. It wasn't just in the United States. It went up in city after city, both here and abroad, and then it began to drop in the 1990s. Now, if you ask the police why did violence go down, they'll tell you it's because we saturated high crime areas. If you ask criminologists and you ask social scientists, they'll say, well, there are a number of factors that we think explain what happened, but we can't isolate which one actually worked. The petering out of the crack epidemic, the growth of the Clinton economy, the lessons learned by a younger generation who decided not to fall prey to drug addiction, the hip hop cultural explosion shifted people's attention away from each other to music creation. There are lots of reasons why people proffer that this happened. But here's the takeaway. The takeaway is that when white people were killing each other daily on the streets of Chicago, of Detroit, of New York City, going back to the 1900s, 10s, 20s, when the same eugenicists and immigration xenophobes were saying, don't let any more Italians into this country, the solution was not more policing. Police brutality existed against them, but the prescriptive claim, the solution to that problem was economic investment, was greater on-ramps to the American dream. Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself argued that many of the New Deal programs were meant to be a form of crime prevention, not by proactive policing, but by sending out-of-work young men off to do conservation work in the West through the CCC. Or the National Youth Administration was a form of basically creating massive summer jobs for out-of-work teens so that they wouldn't be shooting at each other in their off time. So we know that when the white community is suffering from various forms of community harm, the basic idea is that they're too big to jail. And so we have to offer social and economic solutions. When Black people are experiencing various forms of community harm, we keep coming back to the same blunt instrument: more policing. So that's the lesson that we need to take away when it comes to thinking about what's different and what's possible today as compared to in the past.
And I've also heard you talk about the deep coupling between what's happening with racism and our economy. And I believe you used the term racial capitalism. Can you explain that concept to us a little bit and what the implications are behind it?
That's right. So the term itself is becoming more used in historical interpretation and work. So no fault to anybody watching this program if they've never heard it before. But the idea behind it is not new. And the idea behind it essentially is that slavery was the primary instrument of wealth creation in the northern colonies, and then, of course, what became the United States of America. This is true for nearly every major European power that, beginning in the 16th century, began to colonize the rest of the globe. First in the Western Hemisphere, from South America to Central and North America, and then later in the late 19th century into the 20th century, parts of Asia as well as Africa. So people know that history, but the idea that all of that activity going back to the 16th century was a nascent form of global trade that became our capitalist world is what is the argument that has been around for about 75 to 85 years and is now becoming more commonly understood. In a nutshell, most of what we understand in the financial services sector, for example, runs through the histories of slavery and colonialism, which were nothing but a form of racialized control over people deemed different from Europeans. It's not to say that other forms of slavery did not precede this moment, but the economics of what the transatlantic slave trade produced in later European colonization of Africa and Asia was itself formative to what we call our capitalist global system to this day. More recently, when we look at the housing sector, and now I'm just giving a micro example, there is no way to understand the geography of how people live in the United States of America, where they live, or the 10 times wealth gap largely attributed to homeownership between the typical white American family at $170,000 and the typical Black family at $17,000 without understanding systemic private sector and then later sanctioned public sector discrimination. What does that mean? Even more so than that, it means that the value of the real assets that most people hold is defined in relationship to systemic racial discrimination in the housing market, which does two things. On one hand, it devalues Black home ownership and property ownership, increases the cost of access to capital for Black people, and increases the so-called risk of lending to black people. On the other side of the ledger, it falsely or superficially inflates the value of white communities, white home ownership, cheapens credit for white folks, and lowers risk for white folks. It's a both and. You have to talk about both sides of the coin. That's an example of racial capitalism taking us back from the 16th century up to and through the 20th century.
So let's stay with the private sector for a bit. So how should the private sector be thinking about racial capitalism and then integrating more equality and specifically equity into the system, given their position in the economy?
Well, there's two things. The first is that many people in the private sector, by virtue of their education, their experience, I mean, listen, success in America has been defined for a long time by how much money you make, how much wealth you have. It's not an accident that our political class and political culture are dominated by wealthy people, either because they actually running things in the public sector as elected officials, Bloomberg's a perfect example, or because they use their affluence to influence political outcomes. And so where Wall Street puts its money in every presidential election often predicts who will become the next president. None of this is a secret. So we have to understand that we live in a society that is profoundly unequal. It's stratified by definition in terms of what people make and what they own, but it's also stratified by influence. This is not a society that is truly one person, one vote. Besides the Electoral College, which itself is tied to slavery, money matters in who ultimately gets elected to represent us in a representative democracy. So we need to just be honest about that. And we need to stop seeing philanthropy as a form of goodwill and reputational laundering, where essentially we buy legitimacy by spreading a few ducats around in hopes that people will take us seriously when we tell them what to do. Now, I know this is all very sensitive, but this is a hard conversation if we expect people to actually change their behavior. The second thing is that when people end up in unequal circumstances, unequal lives, unequal paychecks, unequal political influence, mostly people then blame them for making bad choices. Oh, your parents didn't stay together. You must not have worked as hard. You should have studied harder so you could go to a better school. Oh, it's too bad you didn't get into Harvard. You know, if you had gotten in, life would have turned out differently for you. So we then read the inequality not as evidence of a structure that produces inequality. By definition, that's what capitalism does. But then we blame those people.
I always wonder why I gotta hurry up and wait for Starbucks and no one's home. I'm sitting by the telephone.
Blessed by the blessed by the